On November 29, 1781, aboard a merchant ship drifting slowly in the Caribbean, everything still appeared unsettlingly normal. The sea was calm, there was no storm, no collision, and the ship still had enough men standing to hold a meeting. Below deck, hundreds of human beings were crammed into darkness, packed into spaces that were never meant to sustain life. Above them, those still strong enough gathered to discuss what they believed was a purely practical problem. There were no screams, no chaos, only short, cold sentences spoken with the confidence of reason. The first disturbing detail was this: the meeting was not about saving lives, but about saving a shipment. In that quiet moment, an invisible moral boundary began to shift, even though no one on board named it aloud. The decision made after this meeting would not only seal the fate of the people below deck, it would send shockwaves through an entire industry. The most terrifying thing on this ship was not disease, not hunger, but a decision made while everything still seemed normal enough for its authors to believe they were doing the right thing. What could make human beings believe that killing people was a reasonable decision? The ship and those holding power on deck. The ship known as the Zong appeared, from the outside, entirely unremarkable. A mid-sized merchant vessel, wooden hull, full sails, moving along a familiar route toward the Caribbean. On deck, daily routines continued as they had on countless voyages before. Below deck, however, the space had already been distorted. Hundreds of human beings were confined inside narrow compartments, deprived of light, air, and freedom of movement. These spaces were never designed to hold so many people, yet the ship continued its journey as if nothing were out of the ordinary. The man officially in command was Captain Luke Collingwood. At this point, he was barely capable of leading. Illness left him disoriented and confined to his quarters, and meaningful decisions were no longer coming from him. Authority on board began to blur. First mate James Kelso, who should have assumed command, had been removed from duty following a serious conflict with Collingwood. He remained on the ship, but without the power to give orders. Into that vacuum stepped Robert Stubbs. He was not a member of the crew, only a passenger on this voyage. But Stubbs had previously captained slave ships and was familiar with the route, maritime law, and the practical realities of voyages like this one. With no clear leadership remaining, his guidance began to carry weight, despite the fact that he held no official authority. At no point was control formally transferred. There was no clear handover of command. Only a series of small decisions, made incrementally by men who believed they were merely keeping the ship functioning. From the very beginning, the Zong did not lack people giving orders. What it lacked was anyone willing or able to take final responsibility. And within such a system, each individually reasonable decision began to drift, unchecked and unconstrained. When no one is truly in command, who decides the fate of hundreds of human lives? To understand how the decisions made aboard this ship could appear calm and reasonable, it is necessary to step away from the deck and look at the world in which it operated. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, Europe had entered a period of unprecedented commercial expansion. Goods, raw materials, and human beings were moved constantly between continents on sea routes that could last for months. These voyages were always dangerous. Storms, disease, shipwrecks, uprisings. And from that danger emerged a new industry, maritime insurance. Rather than asking how to prevent loss, the system asked a different question. If cargo was lost, who would pay for it? Within the transatlantic slave trade, captive human beings were not treated as passengers. They were recorded, priced, and insured like any other form of cargo on board. Each person was assigned a specific monetary value before the ship ever left shore. Insurance law made a clear distinction in how cargo could be lost. If a person died from disease, starvation, or the harsh conditions of the voyage, the ship's owners received no compensation. Such deaths were considered a natural loss of the journey. But if cargo was thrown overboard in a situation claimed to be necessary to save the ship, that loss could be claimed under insurance. In legal terms, it was considered a legitimate act taken to preserve the voyage. On paper, the system never mentioned human life. It spoke only of loss, risk, and financial obligation. And when those rules were applied to people, a dangerous gap began to open. In this system, human life was not weighed by morality or responsibility. It was measured by the wording of an insurance policy. When the law treats human beings as property, where does the line between commerce and crime truly lie? The origins of the zong, when profit was placed above safety. The ship known as the zong did not always carry that name. Before 1781, it was a Dutch vessel called the Zorg, built as an ordinary merchant ship and used for years within the transatlantic trading system. During the war between Britain and the Netherlands, the Zorg was seized by British forces off the coast of Africa. A captured ship was not merely a vessel, but an asset that could be rapidly converted into money. The Zorg was brought into a commercial transaction in Liverpool, where investors were already well practiced in transforming merchant ships into tools of the slave trade. When ownership changed hands, one detail was recorded immediately. 244 captive people already on board were not treated as victims of war. They were counted as part of the ship's material value. The Zorg was renamed the Zong and quickly prepared for a new voyage. The objective was not safety or stability, but speed. To return the ship to a profitable route as quickly as possible. Luke Collingwood was appointed as captain. He was not an experienced seafaring commander. His background was in medicine, having worked as a surgeon on slave ships. His routine work had been to examine captive bodies, assess who was likely to survive the crossing, and determine who would command the highest price upon arrival. From the perspective of the ship's owners, this was not seen as a reckless choice. It was a decision based on existing experience, where the ability to value human beings was considered an advantage. When the Zong departed the West African coast, it carried 442 captive people. This number far exceeded what was considered safe for a ship of its size, more than double the accepted standard of the time. The overcrowding was not a mistake in preparation. It was a deliberate calculation. Every additional person forced on board represented potential profit once the ship reached the Caribbean. From that moment, the margin for error narrowed sharply. The ship was heavier, consumed more water, required more food, and operated under greater strain in every abnormal situation. Yet these risks were not treated as urgent, because the system behind the voyage assumed that the rewards would outweigh any losses. From the moment it left port, the Zong was designed to operate at the edge of its limits. And once control began to slip, there was almost no space left to turn back. When profit is given absolute priority, when does the consequence finally appear? On August 18, 1781, the Zong left the West African coast and began its transatlantic crossing toward the Caribbean. At that moment, there was nothing to suggest this voyage was different from hundreds of slave ships before it. Everything was still considered to be under control. Shortly after departure, the Zong stopped at Sao Tome to take on fresh water. This was a routine procedure, almost automatic. Under normal circumstances, the water supply would be carefully inspected before leaving port. This time, that inspection never happened. The crew member responsible for maintaining and repairing the water casks was ill and unable to work. No replacement was assigned, and no one checked whether the casks were properly sealed before the ship returned to open sea. The Zong sailed away from Sao Tome without anyone on board knowing exactly how much water they carried. There was no clear number, only a familiar assumption that it would probably be enough. Below deck, conditions continued to deteriorate. The spaces were overcrowded, the air stagnant, and the number of people far beyond what the ship was built to carry. Disease began to spread. Each day, more people fell ill, while the crew's ability to manage the situation steadily declined. When the Zong passed Tobago, the ship had another opportunity to replenish its water supply. That opportunity was ignored. The captain was too weak to command. The first mate had already been removed from duty. There was no one with the authority to order the ship to stop. The Zong pressed on, carrying with it every assumption that had gone unverified. With each passing day, the ship grew heavier, not from cargo, but from the weight of decisions left unresolved. Choices that had seemed small and reasonable on their own now began to compound. There was no single moment that could be called a great mistake, only a sequence of familiar decisions, made in familiar circumstances, by men who believed the voyage was still proceeding as normal. The disaster did not arrive all at once. It took shape step by step as each new decision narrowed the possibility of turning back. When all risks finally converged, how would this ship choose to survive? By late November, the ship had entered the waters of the Caribbean. Land appeared on the horizon. The crew believed they were looking at Saint-Domingue, a French-controlled territory. They did not realize they had already passed Jamaica. The Zong continued on the wrong course. Only days later was the mistake recognized. By then, the ship had gone too far to turn back quickly. During that time, conditions below deck deteriorated sharply. Disease continued to spread. The number of deaths increased day by day, not because of a sudden event, but because of conditions that had been building throughout the voyage. At the same time, another fear began to circulate on deck. Rumors spread that the supply of fresh water was running low. No one had an exact figure. There was no reliable record, only the assumption that the remaining water might not be enough for the extended journey ahead. In that context, the officers gathered, not to save the people dying below deck, but to decide how to preserve the voyage. The meeting was quiet and brief. What was weighed was not human life, but financial consequence. They knew that if the captives died from disease or starvation, the loss would not be covered by insurance. But if the cargo was thrown overboard in a situation claimed to be necessary to save the ship, that loss could be claimed. There was no clear proof that the ship was about to run out of water, no confirmation that all other options had been exhausted, only a calculation based on law, risk, and profit. Not a single sentence in that meeting referred to human lives. The decision was not made in anger or panic, but through rules that had been written long before this voyage began. When death becomes a calculation, who is chosen to be sacrificed first? The decision made during the meeting did not remain on paper. It was carried out that very night. The first wave began with those considered least valuable in commercial terms. 54 women and children were brought up onto the deck. They were not selected because they were the weakest, but because men were believed to sell for higher prices once the ship reached port. One by one, they were forced over the side and disappeared into the darkness of the sea. 2 days later, the killings continued. The second wave no longer excluded men. 42 people were taken onto the deck and thrown overboard. There was no change in method, no sign that the decision was being reconsidered. During this period, the weather shifted. Heavy rain fell over the ship. Fresh water was collected and added to the remaining supply. The amount on board increased enough to extend the voyage. The crisis the officers had feared was temporarily resolved. But the actions did not stop. A third wave followed. 36 more people were thrown into the ocean. By this point, the ship was no longer facing an immediate threat of running out of water. In one recorded case, a man who had been thrown overboard managed to cling to the ship and climb back onto the deck. This made it clear that those being killed were not all unconscious or near death. Some were still strong enough to resist, even if only briefly. In total, 142 people were killed and cast into the sea. And throughout the final phase of these killings, the ship still had water. At this stage, the justification of survival no longer existed. There was no longer a clear emergency, no indication that the ship was being forced to choose between life and death. What remained was a sequence of actions that continued simply because they had already begun. And when no one had the authority or the will to stop them, the system carried itself forward until there was nothing left to sacrifice. On December 22, 1781, the Zong arrived in port at Jamaica. There were no visible signs of a ship that had just passed through catastrophe. No alarms were raised. No immediate investigation followed. On board, only 208 people remained alive, less than half of those who had been forced onto the ship when it left Africa. That discrepancy did not trigger any urgent response from port officials or colonial authorities. In the days that followed, the survivors were brought to market. In January, they were sold as commodities, according to procedures that already existed. The average prices were considered acceptable. From a commercial standpoint, the voyage was not treated as a failure. Those who had died were absent from the transactions. They did not appear on the auction floor. They existed only as missing figures in the accounts. Shortly after arrival, Captain Luke Collingwood died from illness. His death occurred before any formal inquiry could take place. Whatever he might have explained about the voyage ended with him. The ship was unloaded, the ledgers were closed, and the next step was triggered, exactly as the system required. The ship's owners submitted an insurance claim for the loss of cargo during the voyage. The matter entered legal channels like any other financial dispute, not as a case of mass killing, but as a calculation of loss. By that point, the disaster had ended at sea. On land, the system had never stopped moving. In 1783, the case of the Zong did not enter the courts as a murder trial. It appeared in the legal system in a different form, an insurance dispute. The hearing took place in London and focused on a single question: whether the ship's owners were entitled to compensation for the loss of cargo. Those who had died were not treated as victims. They were discussed as units of property lost during transport. The owners' argument was straightforward. They claimed that throwing people overboard had been necessary to save the ship and the remaining cargo. Under the principles of maritime insurance at the time, such an act could be considered legitimate. In the initial ruling, the court sided with the ship's owners. According to the law, the loss qualified for insurance compensation. The case might have ended there, like countless other commercial disputes. But the story did not remain confined to the courtroom. Details of what had happened aboard the Zong began to circulate beyond legal records. The case reached the public, and the press quickly became involved. Public pressure forced the case to be reconsidered. An appeal was filed. This time, details that had previously been overlooked entered the record. One of the most critical points raised was the heavy rainfall during the voyage. Evidence showed that fresh water had been replenished afterward, enough to ease the shortage. This revealed another possibility. The killings were no longer driven by survival, but by financial motive. The original ruling was overturned. The court concluded that the loss did not qualify for insurance payment. Yet at this stage, another limitation of the system became clear. Although the insurance claim was denied, no criminal prosecution followed. No one was tried for the deaths of 142 human beings. The case closed in legal records as a resolved financial dispute. The law corrected the flow of money, but the lives that had been taken remained beyond what the system was willing to protect. What happened on the Zong did not end when the ship reached port. It continued in the way society responded afterward. Not as an immediate moral shock, but as a delayed realization that what occurred was not an exception. The Zong did not break the system. It simply exposed how that system functioned when nothing stood in its way. After the story became public opinion in Britain shifted in a rare and visible way. Not because people were hearing about the brutality of the slave trade for the first time, but because it was now presented through the language of law and accounting. Numbers, clauses, and the silence of the courtroom revealed the distance between what was legal and what could be tolerated. From that moment, the abolitionist movement gained momentum. Detailed accounts of conditions aboard slave ships began to circulate more widely. The diagram of the Brooks ship was published, not as a slogan, but as undeniable visual evidence of how human beings were stacked within the system. Change did not come quickly. In 1788, the first law was passed to limit how many people could be packed onto a single ship. In 1807, Britain officially banned the slave trade. And in 1833, slavery itself was abolished across most of the empire. Each step was slow and compromised, but each left lasting marks on law and collective memory. Over time, the Zong ceased to be remembered as a single ship. It became a symbol, not of an extraordinary evil, but of an ordinary system that allowed evil to operate without concealment. When the law is capable of legitimizing such decisions, what boundary remains strong enough to protect human beings within the systems we live under today? If you want to continue exploring stories where systems move beyond human control, consider following the next episodes.